So anyway, let me go ahead and, of course, talk about first, of course, France. Now, France went through a period of revolution and reform. It's kind of a mix of the two because, if you know much about France in the 1800s, they kind of went through a turbulent period where the same thing happened, where they had a couple revolutions that occurred. They had two revolutions, one in 1830, one in 1848. So it's like they kept having these revolutions that they had. And if you remember correctly, we had talked about how before the Congress of Vienna had restored King Louis XVIII. They had put him back in power. Remember, he was one of the brothers of Louis XVI, the uncle of Louis XVII. And this was after Napoleon got exiled twice. In fact, they put him back in 1814. And then when Napoleon was sent to St. Helena Island, of course, he came back again and was restored in 1815. So he comes back in. The Bourbon dynasty rules over France from 1814 to 1830. There's only two kings that are the last Bourbon kings of France, Louis XVIII and his brother Charles X, who reigns right after. Louis XVIII was a constitutional monarch. It was something that the Congress of Vienna forced on him. I think he really wanted to rule as an absolutist, but he couldn't because of what happened with the revolution and Napoleon. And so they created this charter that's called different names, usually called the Charter of 1814. Some people call it the Constitutional Charter of 1814. So it's the one that created a constitutional monarchy, and it created a bicameral legislature that was, I think, called different names. I think they call it the French Parliament or something like that. And it did include like a Bill of Rights, which were kind of based off of the French Revolution and the ideas that Napoleon kind of developed in France before. And it granted all men, like Frenchmen, not women, still equal rights in the country. The king under this constitution had a lot of power. That's the interesting thing about it. Compared to what Louis XVI had, more or less. But the monarch could do different things. Like he could appoint officials, like different ministers, to his government, which, if you know it, I put a lot of the nobility in there, of course, is what he did. He could command the armed forces, like the army, the navy. He could declare war on countries. Also, dictate or sign treaties and stuff like that as well. He could even draft laws and give it to the French Parliament for them to discuss it and pass it. Can you believe that? So he could do all those kind of things also as well. They did have like I said, a bicameral legislature that was set up under Louis XVIII under the Charter of 1814. It was a two-house parliament or legislature, and it had two chambers to it. The lower chamber was for like the middle class, which was mostly comprised of the bourgeoisie, most of the upper middle class. They were mostly in it. That was called the Chamber of Deputies. And then they had another chamber that was called the Chamber of Peers, which was like an upper house. It was controlled by the nobility. So they each kind of separated these two groups into their own chambers, which is kind of crazy what they did with that. That's what happened under it. And of course, a lot of people viewed it as almost like similar to what they had before. This constitutional monarchy, it's almost like the old regime, except it's not absolutist, more or less, because you got Louis XVIII giving power back to the nobility, and so a lot of the lower classes really didn't have as much power. It was mostly, I think, the middle class that had power, and I think the French put like poll taxes on people, so they couldn't vote or hold office, and so it really limited the kind of people that could be in power. So that kind of left a lot of people kind of mad later about that, of course, which will later, lead to further revolution on down the line. Now, Louis XVIII didn't have any children, which is kind of a problem. So he gave the throne to his brother, Charles X, who was known as the Count of Artois. He was dubbed. And Charles X was an ultra royalist. What that meant was that he believed in the idea of restoring the absolute monarchy that was there before, like going back to Louis XVI, Louis XV, Louis XIV. And of course, he's the last Bourbon king. He reigns from 1824 to 1830. And what's going to happen later, of course, is that he's going to basically get overthrown is one of the things. So one of the things that causes him trying to kind of set himself up as a absolutist, it's going to eventually lead to him becoming very unpopular. He tries to take rights away from the lower classes. That eventually leads to his a coup where he gets, taken out over time. Charles X is known for, of course, under France, starting, the French trying to get into Africa, which in the 19th century, if you know about it, all the different European powers started colonizing Africa, which later is called the Scramble for Africa. And that led to the conquest of Algeria, one of the things that the French did over most of the 19th century, which resulted in a lot of genocide of the Algerian population. I think close to 500,000 or more of the Algerian population was killed or wounded in this whole adventure to try to take over Algeria, which is located south of, Spain and all that on the North African coast. And so other countries like in Europe are going to do the same thing. They'll try to take over parts of Europe as well. I did add some other slides, and if you want to look at it later, but of course, those are the actual pictures of some of the kings that were in France, of course, that'll rule at least up to 1848. Louis XVIII, Charles X, of course, both were brothers, last Bourbon kings. The guy on the bottom left is Louis Philippe, or also called Louis Philippe I. He was a cousin of theirs who would reign later. He would seize power after Charles X was basically overthrown. And that's the thing I want to talk about next, of course, what happened. Like I said, Charles X became like an unpopular ruler. And eventually what happened was they had the July Revolution break out in 1830, which they think it was caused by the fact that Charles X was trying to create a coup to create an absolute state. And he passed these ordinances that were known as the July Ordinances. And what they did was it eliminated a lot of rights from the middle class, took rights away from them. Like he was going to get rid of like the freedom of the press, where his government would be able to basically censor everything. Also, he tried to dissolve, I think he did dissolve the Chamber of Peers, the one that was for the middle class mostly. He basically tried to shut it down and get rid of it and maybe just have the one for the nobility is all it would be. He was also going to try to exclude the middle class from elections, from basically holding office, for even voting. Because I think it's around that time they started adding those poll taxes in and stuff like that. That really angered people in France. And so a lot of the middle class backed a revolution, which is called different names. The Revolution of 1830, some people call it the July Revolution as well, which occurs over like a 3-day period in late July of 1830. And the French sometimes call it the Three Glorious Days. It's called different names, I know. It started in Paris, where a lot of the people, middle class and even some of the lower classes, of course, got all involved. And so they threw up barricades, and of course, in Paris. And basically, it became kind of a battle between what was Charles X's government and the people, what they wanted, more or less. And there's, of course, been paintings that have depicted this you may have heard about. That's very famous. Of course, Liberty Leading the People. Considered one of the most famous paintings ever, of course, depicting that time in the revolution. It shows all the people, rebelling against his government, painted by Eugene Delacroix. And so it depicts the revolution of 1830. So you got women getting involved, men, there's even children, supposedly. I don't know if that's true or not, but even children starting to kind of get involved, in this conflict. And what happens eventually is that he's forced to basically go into exile, is what occurs. So he goes into exile. And what happens afterwards, his cousin comes in next, like I told you, which is Louis Philippe, who was known as the Duke of Orleans. He's actually elected king of course, France at that point. And Louis Philippe came from, who's that guy on the bottom there, on the bottom left in that picture there, was from the House of Orleans, which was a separate branch, cadet branch from the Bourbon Capetian line. So they came in. He's like really the only king that ruled from the House of Orleans, the Orleanists, I think they're called later, more or less. He was called all kinds of nicknames. They called him the King of the French people, which he would reign about 18 years, 1830 to 1848. They evidently had a nationwide referendum or plebiscite where people elected him. So he got all kinds of nicknames like the King of the French people, King of the French, the Citizen King. And then, of course, some people also called him the July Monarchy or Monarch, were other names that he was also dubbed as well. Now, talk about some things under Louis Philippe. Yeah, Louis Philippe, like some of these other kings, were kind of conservative type ruler, but that you can see there he did do some things, like he forged kind of an alliance with the British, which that's something you start seeing in the 19th century, more or less up to like World War I. The French and the British become kind of allied, and they even fought together in the Crimean War as an example. But he became unpopular though, because I think because of some of his policies, like he wasn't given enough political rights to the lower classes was one thing with that. And then also he was kind of between these two opposing factions that wanted to take power back again, which was the Bourbons. The Bourbons wanted to put one of their guys back on. And then the Bonapartists wanted to put one of Napoleon Bonaparte's relative on the throne. So it was kind of like, he was kind of stuck between these two different groups that wanted to take over. Louis Philippe became famous, if you know about this, 1840, for bringing back the remains of Napoleon Bonaparte, who, you know about, had originally died on St. Helena. He was buried there. They brought his remains back, and he was buried in Paris in Les Invalides, which is this famous museum and collection of buildings that are in Paris, which is dedicated to France's military history. It's also where a lot of the famous generals, and I think Joan of Arc is buried there and all of that. So he was later buried there. Les Invalides, I guess they called it. And and then that, of course, but it made Napoleon more popular. And so what happened, it was kind of ripe for revolution again, because the people felt like, he wasn't giving enough of the lower classes more rights, Louis Philippe. And so he got overthrown too, also as well. It's crazy. And so in February 1848, Louis Philippe's government, at the end of February 22nd to 24th, got overthrown, what they call the February Revolution in France. And the February Revolution was actually part of several revolutions that broke out in France between 1847 to 1848, which was sometimes called the Revolution or Revolutions of 1848. And you had this deal where there were multiple areas of Europe where people rebelled. Mostly your lower classes and radicals, like working classes, were behind it. And they, like in parts of like Italy, where I think it started first, Greece, Austria, Germany, France, all these, also the Netherlands too. All these different people rebelled, which a lot of it had to do with like a combination of like the Industrial Revolution, I'll get to it later, had taken off, and a lot of people just weren't, the wages just weren't there, the working conditions weren't there. So people were rebelling against that. Also, they had a lot of bad harvests or something that happened too in the 1847, 48 that kind of caused it as well. So people rebelled because of that. And then also because of a lack of political rights. That's why a lot of them also rebelled, especially your middle classes. They wanted more political rights and all that. But most of it was crushed, like Russia, Austria, Prussia, France, etc. Most of the big countries in Europe crushed it, crushed all these different revolutions. And they think some of the Marxists were involved, like Karl Marx, who wrote the Communist Manifesto about 1848. They think some of the early socialists kind of get involved as well. But most of that movement is suppressed for a while until later. But supposedly France's revolution was the only one that was actually successful, believe it or not. And they replaced the monarch Louis Philippe with a republic again. And so 1848, the French went to what they call the French Second Republic, which was a short-lived republic from 1848 to 1852. And France, of course, went to eventually setting up this new government, which came in. And it was based on a new constitution that France created, which was called the Constitution of 1848. What it did was it created the executive position of the president of France. So 1848 to the present, you start getting more executives that run the country, which is the president of France, which is when it started. Although briefly there was an emperor or empire, of course, under Napoleon III, which I'll get to later. But this was an interesting government. It created a unicameral assembly, which was called the National Assembly, which will be one of the main assemblies that they'll call their legislature in France later. And one thing it did have, which was very interesting, was that France starts to go to universal suffrage for all men. They were one of the first to actually do this, like in Europe anyway. And so that's something you see under this period, and also under Napoleon III. I think they had it also as well for a short time. Now, there was, of course, a monarch that came to power who's very interesting, who was, of course, known as Louis Napoleon Bonaparte. You may have heard of him. And he was a nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte. And so what happened was in 1848, he was elected to be the first president of France. He had been in exile for a bunch of years. I think starting right after, like around the end of when Louis Philippe was going out, he came in because they had brought back the remains of Napoleon. And so the Bonapartists became very popular again. I think before they had wanted to put Napoleon II on the throne. He was the son of Napoleon I, but he had died in 1832. So that's why he was Napoleon, later be Napoleon III. The only thing about he only had a 4-year term. If you got elected, president of France, you could only serve 4 years, and then you had to step down. It was like a term limit. And so what happened, if you know about it, Louis Napoleon decided to basically overthrow the government in a coup, dissolve the National Assembly. And then what he did was he declared France again as another French Empire, the so-called Second French Empire, which would go into effect in 1852. 1852 to 1870 would last. And this was all done, by the way, in a referendum, like his uncle, Napoleon Bonaparte, remember, was elected Emperor of France in 1804. And I believe they say 97% of the French people, French males anyway, elected him emperor. I don't know if that's an accurate vote or not. Who knows? But afterwards, he declared himself Emperor Napoleon III. Although, it's funny about this, he actually thought about another title he wanted to be called, which was Prince President. Originally, I think it's how he wanted. This kind of didn't sound very good. But Emperor Napoleon III was obviously a better title. Let me talk a few minutes about the Second French Empire, and then I'll move on to talk about Russia. It was a very conservative, authoritarian state under Napoleon III. Although he kind of got a little liberal later, but man, he was really a tough guy. And if you were against the regime, They sent you into exile, like you saw Devil's Island prison, that penal colony. They sent a lot of people there and got rid of people, or sent them to other colonies and pretty much got rid of you. He, of course, is well known for modernizing France. He's the one that kind of redid the capital of Paris, like redoing all the boulevards and so on. And he also constructed a lot of railroads, modernized France, with railroads, built a lot of canals throughout the country. So it's really under him that France becomes, industrialized power, more or less. Yeah, he's the founder of the Second French Empire. He's the only ruler of the Second French Empire, of course, also as well. Foreign policy-wise, he was involved in a lot of things, if you read about it. Of course, he helped build the Suez Canal, which connected the Mediterranean Sea with the Red Sea. That was all done, of course, under Ferdinand Lesseps that helped build it. He was some kind of French engineer and capitalist who built it. He also began to build a lot of their overseas empire, North Africa, Southeast Asia, like where Vietnam is, French Guiana. All that was stuff he helped develop, more or less. Now, I've got a little documentary I'm going to let you watch later, of course, which I showed a little clip at the beginning of this lecture. But he was known for setting up the French Guiana, which was a penal colony in northern part of South America. And so anybody that was like the dregs of society, criminals or whatever, they got rid of people. They sent people by the thousands there. Most people didn't come back. They either stayed in the colony or they died. Majority of them died, of course, there, more or less. But you can watch the video later about that. He also got in control, tried to take over Mexico. I don't know if you know about this too, but they had the so-called French intervention of Mexico by the French in the 1860s. This is when the American Civil War was kind of going on at the same time. And he put one of his cousins on the throne, who was from Austria, named Maximilian. They called him Emperor Maximilian I. And he was actually the ruler of the Mexican Empire, as they called it, for a short time. But the French later overthrew him, if you know about this, and they later shot him, his cousin. So it didn't last long, that idea. Also later, I won't talk about it now, but I want to get to Russia. He also supported the British with the Ottoman Empire, the Turks, against Russia in the Crimean War. That's where the French gave aid, which basically helped defeat Russia in the war. And so because of that, Russia ended up declining after the war, which I'll talk about later in the late 19th century. So that happened 1853-56. So he was in that adventure too. Then his last thing he got into, of course, which I'll get to later, not today, but just kind of talking about for now. But he also went to war with Prussia and what they call the North German Confederation, which formed in the 1860s and later led to the so-called Franco-Prussian War, which was about a 6-month war from 1870-71. That was a total fiasco. If you know what happened, he got totally beat in that war. Prussia invaded France, took Paris, and it caused the collapse of his empire, more or less. So he would go into exile later, and the French declared a republic after that, and then France never had a monarchy anymore after that. So he was the last monarch, that the French actually have, if you really read about him. And I've got some other slides if you want to look at it later, but Napoleon was not that great of a ruler compared to his uncle. He was probably more impressive, more or less. So yeah, Suez Canal, they opened in 1869. Yeah, a lot of people died building it. You can see 120,000 workers died in the construction of it, but it basically connected what is the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea. And of course, a shortcut if you want to get to like Asia, like India, China, and in the East, and all of that. Of course, I just talked about that, about the Devil's Island. Of course, I'll have that documentary for you later in the assignment for that. All right, let me go ahead and move on. I want to next talk about Russia today, so I need to finish that up too as well. Now, Russia of course, if you know much about it, the Romanov dynasty continued into the 19th century. The Romanovs would have I'll give you the slide here for you to look at it, but the Romanovs had about 5 more rulers that would come later. Alexander I, Nicholas I, Alexander II, Alexander III, and Nicholas II. So those are the 5 that would be part of course, the later czars, which of course they would go into the beginning of the 20th century under Nicholas II. And Russia went through a lot of conflicts during that time. Go back to the slide here. I kind of got one right here. Russia was backwards. It was still behind all the other powers. I know they were trying to modernize, but most of the West, like France and all those countries, Germany and so on, Austria, were becoming more westernized. And so that was still kind of a problem. A lot of oppression, censorship, of course, against the lower classes, lesser nobility, and maybe upper middle class. It was kind of a problem. And then, of course, the czars were very anti-liberal. They didn't like any kind of liberal ideas, radical ideas in Russia much. People like that were either imprisoned or sent into exile, like either out of Russia or Siberia, more or less. But later in the 19th century, Russia would become more weaker. They start declining. They start losing a lot of wars. Lost the Crimean War. Even lost the war to Japan. Crazy. The early 1900s. Later as well. So all these things, of course, lead to that later. Russia, by the way, was huge. It was a massive empire, which I want to say was like 11, 12 million square miles, some crazy amount. That went from like around the Ukraine, you can see the Black Sea, all the way to the Pacific Ocean. So it was huge, but very few people lived in the eastern part of Russia, which of course was called Siberia, more or less. So yeah, let me go ahead and talk about some of the czars that were, of course, famous in the 19th century. Of course, I just talked about Alexander I. He, of course, was a very staunch conservative, which I think was caused mostly by Napoleon and the French Revolution. So he rejected a lot of those ideas, of course, and he favored a lot of the policies of Clemens von Metternich, who had run the Congress of Vienna after the Napoleonic Wars ended. So he helped Metternich to really crack down on anybody that was considered liberal or radical. And he even helped, I think not him, but some of his later successors later would help crack down on pretty much most of that up to 1848, like even the revolutions of 1848. He, by the way, was famous, if you know about it, for defeating Napoleon. Remember, Napoleon invaded in 1812, and then he got the European coalitions to march on France and take Paris. And so he helped basically knock Napoleon out of the wars and pretty much exile him overall. Now, he died in 1825, Alexander I, and there was a conflict over his throne. If you know about it, Alexander had 2 brothers, one named Constantine and one named Nicholas. Constantine was older. Constantine should have got the throne, but Constantine didn't want the throne. He wanted to just, I think under Alexander, he was like ruling over like Poland and the Ukraine for him or something like that. It was just like a duke, basically. And so he abdicated the throne to his brother, which was Nicholas I, who would reign for 30 years, Emperor Nicholas I. However, what happened was apparently a bunch of the officers that were in the army under Alexander I didn't like that idea. Because they thought Nicholas was more conservative, Constantine was more liberal, and so what happened was liberal army officers that were under the Russian military basically rebelled, and let me get out. So, lost my screen there for a second. Let me get it back up. They rebelled against him, and so about 3,000 of them marched on what is it's actually a square in what is now St. Petersburg. I think they changed the name of it later, but it was originally called, let me pull up the name. I believe it's called Peter Square. I forget what they call it now. There's another name they've changed it to. I can't remember the name of it now for some reason, but it was on the date of December 26, 1825. And Nicholas came out and basically had to put it down. And so the revolt was crushed. The Decembrists some of them were killed in the incident, and a bunch were put on trial. And most of them some were executed. And then, if you know about it, a bunch of them were sent into exile to Siberia. It's something that the czars start doing a lot to people that are against the regime. So they do think that that's kind of how Russia starts getting all these revolutionaries later that want to rebel up to, like, the Russian Revolution later, or two of them that happened later. It's all because of the Decembrist revolt, because they didn't want to, I guess, create reforms, because the Decembrists wanted some kind of constitutional reform, like a constitutional monarchy, but they didn't want it. Okay, so you had that happen. Then what happened then? So Nicholas came in, and of course later they have the Crimean War. Of course, that would break out. That's really one of the most famous incidents that happened in the mid part of the 19th century, which occurred from 1853-56. Crimean War was one of the probably three major wars that happened in Europe in the 19th century. The other two would be the Napoleonic Wars, which we already talked about, and then later I'll get into the Franco-Prussian War. I think those are the three big ones they had. I think it's like, I don't know, it's kind of considered, I think, the second bloodiest of those three. About 1 million were probably killed overall between both sides. And basically the conflict was between two sides. Russia on one side, outnumbered by the Ottoman Empire, the British, and the French. And you can see that France and Britain declared war on Russia in 1854, but Ottoman Empire declared war on them in 1853. So it started before that. So Turks were in it first, and then Britain and France came in to support the Turks. A lot of it had to do with trade and also conflicts over the Black Sea region, which the French and British were kind of concerned about, more or less. But there are multiple conflicts. I think at least three major conflicts, three major causes, that really caused the Crimean War to really break out. One was conflicts over the Black Sea, the Balkans Peninsula, which I want to talk about first. If you know about it, the Ottoman Empire was weakening in the 19th century. I think it was Emperor Nicholas I who came up with that famous quote that Ottoman Empire was basically sick old man of Europe, basically. The sick old man of Europe. And you expand that for me. I'll expand that. And come on in. Yeah, hey. But anyway, but yeah, the Ottoman Empire was a sick old man of Europe, and so it was declining. It was a major power. So Russia wanted to take advantage of that, seize territory from them around the Black Sea, like close to the Crimean region, like to the west of it, especially where Romania is, like on the western side of the Black Sea. Romania, maybe going down to where Bulgaria is, and take that area as well from them. And they started doing that, started seizing territory from them in the war. So the French, British would come in and support them. Also, issues over Christian churches in the Holy Land. The French were Catholic, They wanted the churches in the Holy Land to be mostly controlled by Catholic priests rather than Orthodox priests. And so that caused a lot of tensions between France and Russia while they also got in the war. Holy Land was controlled by the Ottoman Empire at the time. So the Ottomans were okay with that, but the Russians were not. And then trade issues. That was another issue too as well. The British and the French were worried about the Far East, about trade, because they want to get into like China and all that. And so they're really concerned that the Russians may affect that in the East. So they want to weaken their empire, more or less. So that's just kind of some of the things that, basically what happened with that. The Crimean War is also known for being one of the first modernized wars to occur in the 19th century. It's one of the first wars where they actually use railroads to mobilize forces. In fact, that's part of why the coalition side won against Russia, because they actually built eventually a railroad that connected to where the Crimean Peninsula is, or close to it. And so they were able to bring more forces in to eventually defeat the Russians on the Crimean Peninsula. Also used the telegraph for telecommunications, which that helped, communicate from the, headquarters to front lines as well. And also people knew about the war. They knew, like, if somebody got killed or wounded within a day or two, rather than maybe a month later, more or less. It's also the first photographed war as well. So you get to see like pictures of the landscape of the where the war is being fought. You get to see pictures of the soldiers in their uniforms or on their horses or whatever. That's something you don't get to see much before. They had paintings, is pretty much. And this war and the American Civil War are probably the two first big wars where they use photography and all that. Oh, and also Florence Nightingale, if you know about her, she was kind of important in being involved in developing modern nursing. They called her the lady with the lamp. And she was one of the first to create like hospitals to help wounded soldiers, mostly, I guess, British soldiers, more or less. And she actually, after the war, later went on to set up the first nursing school to teach nurses and so on. So she's considered the so-called, the mother of modern nursing, the one that basically got started, the founder of it, pretty much. Now, the Crimean War would drag on. Of course, they fought around the Balkans region, but the actual most of the fighting took place on the Crimean Peninsula. That's where they fought it, and that's pretty much why it was called the Crimean War. So they fought on this peninsula here. And that was, by the way, the whole war was just a disaster for both sides. Neither side could really win the war, and it would drag on for a couple years. And it's often kind of been called kind of a folly, the war, if you study about it. And it was fought in the northern Black Sea. What happened was the French, British, Turks, and also some of the Italian forces were involved. They brought up troops using naval power. And basically, the French, British, and their allies couldn't take the peninsula, so it led to a long siege, more or less, for last over like a year or so. And it resulted in like close to 1 million casualties on both sides. I think the Russians took more casualties in the whole conflict. And so they laid siege to the siege of Sevastopol. Sevastopol is important because it was where the Russian Black Sea Fleet is, which it still is today, right now. And so they wanted to take that, and that would enable them to defeat the Russians in that part of southern Russia and all of that. Like I said, the whole thing would last too long, last around a month or so, 1854 to 1855. And I think the most famous battle associated with usually that period is the Battle of Balaclava, you may have heard of, which happened in October of 1854. That was like an offensive battle involving the British, which later got associated with the so-called Charge of the Light Brigade. You may have heard about that. It was later made into a poem by Alfred Lord Tennyson. And they charged in the Valley of Death, and of course took a lot of casualties from it. And that was part of an offensive by the British, and I guess involving the French, etc., that really caused a stalemate where neither side could really win. So they failed to take it, but after a long siege, the Russians basically gave up because neither side could win. And so the Russians just scuttled their fleet, and they left the Crimean Peninsula after that. But yeah, of course, the Allies would occupy that in Russia, and the Treaty of Paris, would basically be forced not to really control Crimea and the Black Sea. They were basically given no rights to basically be there afterwards. And so Russia really starts to decline after that, after the war. And they start becoming a weaker power. They even kind of get out of international politics and all that and don't really get involved much in it pretty much after that. Let me briefly talk about a few more czars that were also famous later as well, and that'll probably be it. We're talking about the Russians. Now, they have some other czars that would, of course, rule later as well. Of course, they had the czar you see at the top, whose name was Alexander II. He reigned from 1855 to 1881. And he was, of course, humiliated about what happened with the war. And he believed that part of why that was because of the fact that Russia internally needed reforms. They needed to industrialize. They needed to change the culture. They needed to free all the serfs, give people rights. And so you know about it in 1861, Alexander II freed all the serfs in Russia. It was a kind of a amazing idea. It was like 20, I don't know, I forget how many it was, 25 to 27 million, somewhere in that range. It was over 25 million or more, I know. But more than 25 million, I think. It might have been 25, 30 million. I'm not sure the exact number. But basically, on March 3rd, he issued this emancipation edict that basically freed millions of serfs throughout Russia. And he put them on what they call mirs. Mirs was this Russian idea of land reform, where they set up these peasant village communities where basically all peasants could basically share the land with each other so they could grow crops. And so everybody had a communal ownership of the land, and it all depended on how large of a family that they had, more or less. They also call it obshchina as well. And the Russians would have this kind of farming economy until really the early 1900s, up to about 1906. They'll have it in place until they have the Stolypin reforms, which try to make Russia more capitalist, but it didn't really work later. And then the Bolsheviks took over and they collectivized everything, if you know about that, of course, later. So Russia kind of modernized that aspect a little bit, but it really didn't, I think, solve all the problems, more or less. Also, other things that Alexander did too, as well. The second, he also sold Alaska. I don't know if you know the story about this, but 1867, that's how bad things are for Russia, declining. They even sold Alaska to the United States. It was under President Andrew Johnson, the Secretary of State at the time. William Seward was involved in the purchase of it. And people later joked in America that it was called Seward's Folly or Seward's Icebox because we thought that we just bought a bunch of icebergs up there and all that and polar bears. But of course, later on, we find that there's got a lot of gold up there and oil on Alaska, which is pretty important. Oh, also, Alexander II was known for industrializing the country, like mostly in the western part of it. And one of the chief things he started doing was building a lot of railroads throughout the country. That was something he was known for. Before that, they had hardly any railroads at all. They were just backwards, more or less. And so he's starting to try to modernize them. But what happened was in 1881, he was assassinated by this terrorist group called the People's Will. Kind of a revolutionary group that's kind of before the other ones that'll come later, like the Bolsheviks. The Tsar Liberator was killed. His son took over, Alexander III, and he was kind of a reactionary. The guy on the bottom, he was a reactionary type czar, second to last czar of Russia, and very pro-Orthodox ruler. He wanted to, force everybody to be Orthodox Christian. And if you were Jewish, was a lot of Jews lived in like the Ukraine, around Poland. A lot of them were terrorized in various what they call pogroms. You may have heard about, starting in the 1880s and 1890s under him. He tried to get a lot of them to leave, which some of them did leave. later went to the West, or even some, I think some even came to America. I know it fled more than anything. So it's kind of anti-Semitic and all that. Alexander III did have a nickname. He was called the Peacemaker because he made peace with other countries like France and Britain, etc., which will be important later for, when World War I breaks out, because, France and Britain will have like an ally and all that. And then, of course, one of the most famous things that he did under his reign was, of course, he started building the Trans-Siberian railway network, which was very important, which I do have a map of to show you. And I'll show you a little in a second. But basically what it was this railroad network that connected the western part of Russia, like eventually Russia and also Ukraine later. And it connected this eastern part, like into Siberia. Went from Moscow to Vladivostok on the Pacific Ocean. And the length of it was close to 6,000 miles in length. It's considered to be the longest railroad network in the world. He started in 1891, and then his son, Nicholas II, would later finish it during World War I in 1916. I do got a map of it to show you, which I can, but you can see here, starts here basically in what is pretty much Eastern Europe. Later they would connect it also to Central Western Europe. So you can actually go from Britain, start here, railroad, go all the way to the Pacific Ocean where Vladivostok is. They even had branches that would go down into Korea, I think at one point in China, and also I think Mongolia. I think there was some lines that went down here, like I know in the Soviet Union and all that. But basically it was kind of in a way to connect the vast territories, of Russia that was, just so huge, more or less. And they think it started from various roads, like a Trans-Siberian, like some kind of road system that ran, or highway system that ran from west to east across Russia overall. Then a few minutes, let me talk about just briefly about also, you have also one more czar you may have heard of course, which is the Tsar Nichols II. He, of course, was the last czar of Russia. He's the last Romanov, of course, czar that they have. And he was one of the last major autocrat type rulers in Europe. And he held on to power until, World War I, more or less. But because of World War I and lack of reforms in his country, also the Russo-Japanese War they lost as well against Japan, the empire was really declining, lack of reforms still in the country. And what happened was in 1917, he was overthrown due to the Russian Revolution, so-called February Revolution, they called it. Later, the Bolsheviks seized power, about it. And the communists, they took over Russia. And about it, they killed the Tsar and his whole family. They were murdered in 1918. They think Anastasia was killed too. I know there's a legend about that she survived, but they think all of them were killed because I think in the 1990s their bodies were later found. So, but I'll talk about that later, the Russian Revolution, when I get to like World War I. Not now, but I've got a few minutes. Let me go ahead and quickly review, and that'll be it for this lecture. So I want to go ahead and wrap up that because pretty much this is going to be where your second exam is going to end. So who was the king restored to the French Bourbon dynasty 1814, 1815, after Napoleon was exiled? That was, of course, Louis XVIII, who was the brother of Louis XVI. Who was his younger brother? The Count of Artois, who was the last Bourbon monarch. He was an ultra-royalist. That was, of course, Charles X. What was the July Revolution? Called different names. It was called the Revolution of 1830. That was a revolution where a lot of the middle classes overthrew the regime of Charles X because they wanted power. And you saw that painting I showed you earlier, of course, the Liberty League Leading the People by Eugene Delacroix, which, of course, depicts all the people, even the lower classes and women, children getting involved. He was put on the throne in 1830 as a citizen king or king of the French people. He was called all kinds of names, July monarch as well. That was Louis Philippe, known as the first, who was a cousin of Louis XVIII and Charles X. He was from the House of Orleans, and he came in, and whose remains were brought back to France under his reign. That was Napoleon Bonaparte, who they brought back his remains in 1840 to be buried in Paris. What revolution overthrew his monarch in 1848? That was the February Revolution, which was part of the revolutions of 1848 in Europe. He was overthrown, and what happened was the French declared another republic, the so-called French Second Republic. Who became first president of France in 1848? How was he related to Napoleon I? That was Louis Napoleon Bonaparte. He was a nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte. What did this ruler do in 1852? What was his title afterwards? He overthrew the French government and established the Second French Empire, and he afterwards went by the title Emperor Napoleon III. What were some major events that happened under the Second French Empire? One was he built the Suez Canal, or helped build it. The Suez Canal, 1869. He modernized France, like Paris, and built railroads, canals, industrial revolution as well. French Guiana, established that. He was involved in the intervention of Mexico, which failed in the 1860s. He was later defeated in the Franco-Prussian War, 1870-71, which caused the collapse of his empire, of course, after. Who was the main ruler of Russia in the early 19th century, 1825? What was he famous for? That was Alexander I. He was known, of course, for defeating Napoleon in the Napoleonic Wars. He also was a staunch conservative that supported the Congress of Vienna and also Metternich. The Decembrist Revolt was a revolt of liberal army officers in the Russian army under Nicholas I when he seized power. They wanted to have a liberal government with the constitutional monarchy. Nicholas said no and basically arrested them all and forced most of them into exile. This happened in 1825. And it's called Decembrist because it happened in December. What was the Crimean War or conflict? What caused it? Crimean War was a major war in the mid-19th century, 1853 to 1856, between Russia versus the Ottoman Empire, France, and Britain. And it was caused by multiple conflicts. One was because of the decline of the Ottoman Empire, the fact that the Russians wanted to control the Black Sea region, like around Romania. And then also it was caused by religious conflicts in the Holy Land. French wanted control of the churches, Christian churches there. Orthodox wanted control of churches there in Russia. So, and the French and the British were also worried about Far East trade, like in Asia, Black Sea all the way to China. And so that was another reason for it. Why was it considered one of the first modern wars in history? Told you it was a bunch of reasons for that. One, it was the first major war where they used railroads and telegraph lines for telecommunications. It was the first photographed as well. Told you about modernized nursing started with Florence Nightingale. I think was something I had talked about before as well. It was also, I showed you the first photograph war, of course. But yeah, first photograph war and all that, of course, to be done. What siege was the most significant campaign where the Turks, British, French seized the Crimean Peninsula? That was the siege of Sevastopol, which lasted about a year from 1854 to 55. It resulted in the Russians losing the war. What famous reform was done by Tsar Alexander II? He freed all the serfs in March of 1861. What did the Russians call him after that? They called him either Alexander the Liberator or the Liberator Tsar, one of the two. What famous railroad was started by Tsar Alexander III, who began modernizing Russia under him? That was the Trans-Siberian Railroad or Railway that connected Western Russia with Siberia to the Pacific coast. He also was known for selling Alaska. You know about that, Alexander III, which we got from him. Who's the last Tsar of Russia? That, of course, was Emperor Nicholas II. He would later be overthrown, of course, in the Russian Revolution of 1917, which I'll, of course, talk about later. So that's pretty much it lecture-wise. Of course, for this period, this is, of course, going to be where I'm going to stop the lecture material for the second exam. I told you the second exam is going to only include material from the Scientific Revolution, Age of Enlightenment, French Revolution, Age of Napoleon, and then this period I talked about today, of course, in the 19th century. So that's pretty much it. And of course, I'm not sure what's going to happen Thursday, lecture-wise. Of course, I know we got this storm coming, more or less. So I guess be checking on the weather. So just remind you about completing assignments this week, even though this thing's coming up and all that. But I'll go ahead and post this lecture onto my YouTube channel, of course, afterwards. So if you got any questions about it, let me know. Comments-wise, questions-wise, just send me, like I said, like you've done before, send me any kind of comments, questions on YouTube. But if it's an administrative question about the class, just email me, of course, about that. So that's it for today. Hope y'all are doing fine out there. Y'all take care, and I'll see you later with a lecture this week or whenever. Okay? So y'all take